Government schools use communist tactics and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome, everybody. This podcast is called Government Schools Use Communist Tactics. Well, we know that they are using communist tactics, not just because of the history that we have read, but now we actually have a Virginia mom who survived Maoist China and says when you have the DOG and the school boards working together to silence parents, those are communist tactics. So in Fairfax County, Virginia, a Virginia mom who endured the Maoist Cultural Revolution before immigrating to the U.S., and the National School Boards Association and the Justice Department are using tactics similar to the ones she saw Communist China use to stop parents from speaking out. So during Mao's Cultural Revolution, of course, in Communist China, Mao Zedong was using the public education system to do what? To indoctrinate children. And the school system was used to indoctrinate those children so that they understood that the only way of thinking is the communist way of thinking and that you don't ever question anything. So critical thinking skills aren't allowed. There's no dissent. There's no diversity of opinion. Those things weren't allowed in Mao's Cultural Revolution. And if you dared to dissent, you would be put into some sort of gulag or concentration camp, or just you would be erased. You would disappear. And so this mom, who now lives in Virginia, said this, and she lived in Maoist China. We have a couple of clips from her, but before we play them, remember what has caused her to say this. She's saying this about our public school system in Virginia and throughout the United States because of the simple fact that so many people are upset with what they are hearing about critical race theory in public school system. Namely, of course, that you're being taught and your children are being taught to judge one another and hate one another simply by the way they look. But also the whole institution of normalizing transgenderism. That is to say, normalizing it, but teaching it as almost like a preferred lifestyle in public school. Remember, teaching it as a preferred lifestyle, that it is actually the norm, and you are not the norm if you consider yourself to be a male or a female. You're not the norm because you're not using confusing pronouns to describe yourself. You're only the norm if you use really unusual pronouns like they, their, and them. And then, of course, if you were to do that in the public school system, well, then you're, of course, woke. You're the cool person. That's what they want to teach. What does that have to do with math? We've talked about this before. What does that have to do with science? What does it have to do with reading and writing? Of course, and as I've said many times in this podcast, get any high school senior or junior and try to get them to write something for you that is just even somewhat intelligible. And students who are allegedly A students and B students and C students, they can't do it. They can't. But you know what they can do? Oh, they can tell you and recite to you all the transgenderism nonsense that they're being taught. Well, this mom in Virginia, in Fairfax County, who grew up in Maoist China, spoke to the media about her experiences. And we have two clips on this, and they are incredibly interesting. Here is the first clip.
When I was in China, I spent my entire school years in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So I'm very, very familiar with the communist tactics of how they divide people, how they cancel the Chinese traditional culture and destroy our heritage. And all this is happening here in America. Now they are labeling parents and concerned citizens like me as domestic terrorists. What that can do? You may lose your freedom. I do have a question. What's next step? Is the Tiananmen Square crackdown the next? Would parents one day risk their life just to speak out for the children.
Yeah, so that is epic to have a Chinese American mom who grew up, of course, in Maoist China, speaking out about what she's seeing today happen in her public school systems. And as you know, podcast listeners, this is all in part a response to Attorney General Merrick Garland's announcement last week that he was going to put together a task force to determine how federal law enforcement can use tools to prosecute criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. In other words, if you go to a school board and you speak out against this crazy woke crap that your children are being indoctrinated with in the public school system, that you could be considered to be an extremist, and you could be someone who is ginning up threats and violence, and therefore you could potentially be arrested in the United States of America. So this mom, this Chinese American mom, is like calling this out in a big way. And she's calling it out in a big way because she's saying, well, are we going to have a Tiananmen Square massacre in the United States? By the way, podcast listeners, we actually have a story on that that's in the Wall Street Journal that we're going to cover shortly. And it's just incredibly timely that we have this information in the Wall Street Journal about what's happening in Hong Kong concerning a particular monument to the Tiananmen Square victims. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first, we have the second clip of this mom in Virginia talking about her experiences in Maoist China versus what she's seeing happening in the United States today in the public school system. We have that clip, and here it is.
In China, the public school, are really government school. And here is the same things happening here. The radical left has already taken over our educational system. They control the schools, the school board, and other associations such as Teacher Association and National School Board Association. And they actually have been training our children to be the social justice warriors for a long time.
Just like in Maoist China, the children were indoctrinated. And by the time those children got out of the public school system in Maoist China, they were so thoroughly indoctrinated that as far as they were concerned, Mao was a god. And in no sense would you ever criticize a god because he was divine. He was supposed to be there because communism is a religion. And this mom does something that I think is epic. She calls them government schools, not public schools. I'm really proud of the fact that years ago, I started calling these schools government schools. And I remember when I first started to do that in the Maryland House of Delegates, the Democrats got triggered. I mean, they were really triggered. They were like, government schools, they're not government schools, they're public schools. Now we see they really are government schools, right? Because they're about perpetuating only one ideology, and that is the government ideology. Also, this mom in Fairfax County, Virginia, who grew up in China and is now an American citizen, she talked about how the radical left is really just like communism. Isn't it interesting that the radical left, under Merrick Garland as an example, they're telling us, the free people of the United States, that we are the radicals. We are the terrorists. We are the extremists because we actually have a different opinion than them and that we should be locked up. And in fact, they are the ones that are practicing the extremism. They are the radicals. They are the ones that are intolerant of any other opinion. They are the ones that don't want you to learn in different ways and have diversity of thought. And radical left ideologies have traditionally been those ideologies that have led to socialism, that have led to communism, not conservative ideologies. And so it's fascinating to me that it takes someone who grew up in Maoist China to speak so plainly and commonsensically to the media about her experiences in communist China and now seeing the government schools, what they're doing and how they're trying to do the exact same thing. Case in point, that mom mentioned the Tiananmen Square massacre. She's like, well, I sure hope that doesn't happen here. And she's right. Get this, podcast listeners. In the Wall Street Journal today, there is an opinion piece. Hong Kong is erasing the Tiananmen Square massacre. Yeah, so remember, Hong Kong was turned over to mainland communist China. Communist China immediately cracked down and arrested the Hong Kong protesters, all of whom, by the way, have completely disappeared. Do you read any stories about where they are? If they're safe? If they're alive? They've disappeared. They were arrested. Classic communism. And the Hong Kong is erasing the Tiananmen, by the way, reminds me a little bit of the so-called insurrection where people were arrested and they've disappeared. Apparently being held in solitary confinement, which is really kind of weird. The similarity between our two countries right now. But in Hong Kong, now that communist China controls Hong Kong, there is a monument of the massacre at Tiananmen Square. And that monument is going to have to come down. Because you can't have monuments. Doesn't that sound just like the left in the United States of America? Not allowed to have monuments to remind you of things. You can't do that. Whether they be good or bad. You can't have monuments. There's only one way of thinking. So here is the Wall Street Journal article. A gruesome sculpture rises from a courtyard at the University of Hong Kong. It depicts dozens of human bodies contorted in agony, some with mouths open in silent screams, some skeletal and apparently motionless. The public university has demanded that this work of art be removed by 5 p.m. Wednesday, which is 5 a.m. Eastern in the United States, Wednesday being today, an ultimatum Hong Kongers find more horrifying than the statue's grisly presence. The sculpture, entitled The Pillar of Shame, memorializes the victims of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Its creator, Danish artist Jens Galschot, calls the work of an overt accusation of the old men's regime in Beijing and a litmus test of authorities' vow to respect human rights and free speech in Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party has already erased the memory of what happened at Tiananmen Square inside of China, and now they will do the same in Hong Kong, Mr. Galschot says. He's the guy that made the monument, made the sculpture. In a letter last week, the university's lawyers said that if the Pillar of Shame wasn't gone by their deadline, the sculpture will be deemed abandoned, and the university will deal with the sculpture at such time and in such manner as it thinks fit without further notice. Beijing imposed a national security law in Hong Kong last year that criminalizes dissent. I want to read this again, podcast listeners. Beijing imposed a national security law in Hong Kong last year that criminalizes dissent. Does that not sound like the school boards and Merrick Garland? They are criminalizing dissent at school boards, labeling you a terrorist so that they can potentially arrest you, maybe even erase you. It's happening here in the United States, podcast listeners. And so I'm going to continue with the article. So finding a new vocal forum willing to display the Pillar of Shame will be difficult, especially on short notice, Mr. Galschot says. He adds that his fiber cement sculpture has already required repairs and probably is a bit frail. He fears that if people from a construction firm come with a crane and a truck and try to put this away somewhere, which of course they will, I think they're going to destroy it, he said. Maybe they want to destroy it in front of people. Who knows? Also, disturbing to Mr. Galschot is that the law firm Meyer Brown wrote the ultimatum letter on behalf of the university. They are connected to an attack on art, an attack on democracy in Hong Kong, the artist says. And they must take responsibility for that. Meyer Brown describes itself as a global services provider, compromising associated legal practices that are separate entities. The majority of its attorneys are in the United States of America. A law firm, Meyer Brown is the name of the law firm, gets its could be Mayer or Meyer Brown. They are the ones who are the legal arm of this university in Hong Kong and are forcing the sculpture to be removed, and doing so at the behest of the communist government. Because the left doesn't like inconvenient statues. The left doesn't want statues of folks who fought in the Civil War on behalf of the South because of the fact that it's something that they just don't want to remember and learn from, right? That's the purpose of statues. There's a teaching moment of statues, including those of good people and those of bad people. There's a teaching moment. But the left doesn't want teaching moments because there's only one way of thinking. And if you do not think that way, that statue will be removed. Or if you decide that you have a different way of thinking and you go in front of a school board, you will be removed. You will be canceled. And so the article continues, quote, "We were asked to provide a specific service on a real estate matter for our long-term client, the University of Hong Kong," says Lisa Sachdov, a spokeswoman for the firm Meyer Brown. Quote, "Does not have a headquarters and is a global business," she says. "Our role as outside counsel is to help our clients understand and comply with current law." Ha! "Our legal advice is not intended as commentary on current or historical events." Yeah. So she says, our legal advice is not intended as commentary on current or historical events, says Lisa Sachdov, who is a spokeswoman and lawyer for the firm Meyer Brown. In other words, what she's saying is that her firm, and I want to be clear about this, not her, but her firm are a bunch of whores who are willing to work for anybody for money. And I rarely use that kind of terminology. Her firm is. Her firm is a firm that's all about the money. And it doesn't matter who they work for, how evil they are, what they're trying to do to humanity, doesn't matter, as long as they get paid. And this is an American firm that is doing this on behalf of the University of Hong Kong, taking down a statue and forcing it to be removed at the behest of the communist government. And you wonder, podcast listeners, are parts of our own business community, legal community, politicians, government, society, are they being co-opted by these communists? And the answer is, of course they are. Here's proof right here. Here's proof right here. And of course, they want to make that even worse. The government does by having government schools where that's the only place that you're allowed to go because you can't afford to go and send your kids to private school because it's so expensive. You're being taxed so much. You don't have any extra spending money to do that for your children. You can't homeschool them because you don't have the time to do it because you're too busy trying to keep up with inflation. So you can't, send them to private school or homeschool them because you're busy working like, most regular people in the United States. And then you have these idiots who work for law firms who are like, we're a global business. We're a global business. And so therefore, quote, "Our role as outside counsel to the University of Hong Kong is to help our clients understand and comply with current law." So if current law changes and current law is we must erase the Tiananmen Square massacre, well, then we're going to follow that current law. The action against the Pillar of Shame is the latest in a series aimed at purging the historical events of Tiananmen Square from Hong Kong's collective memory. That was always the point, of course, of getting rid of statues, ladies and gentlemen. The point of getting rid of statues in America, just like the point of getting rid of statues and books that have historical references in communist countries, is so that the next generation will forget. Because you teach them in government schools, you don't teach them the history. You teach them about transgenderism, not history, of course. And so they grow up being complete morons and idiots because they don't know anything. And then one day there's a Tiananmen Square type massacre in their generation. And then finally, they're like in the Matrix, and then they wake up and they're like, well, wait a minute. That's really bad. You mean this has happened before? Why wasn't I taught? Well, because all the statues were removed and all the references to it were removed. You weren't allowed to learn about it. For decades, thousands gathered in Victoria Park on June 4th, the anniversary of the massacre, for a solemn vigil organized by the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China. But since 2020, Hong Kong police have refused to issue a permit for the event and have warned that anyone who showed up could face criminal charges. So all these individuals want to do is to have a protest and memorial to remember Tiananmen Square. And if they were to get together, they would face criminal charges, kind of like Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, that's saying if you show up at a school board and you criticize it and you don't go along, then you will face criminal charges. You know, kind of like that dad who showed up in Loudoun County trying to talk about his daughter who was raped in the bathroom by an alleged transgender student who was a boy who was allegedly wearing a dress in a girl's bathroom and then sodomized and raped this gentleman's daughter. And all he wanted to do was go in front of the school board to begin the process of healing and provide transparency and talk about what's very wrong with our school system, that this would even happen and that they're not even acknowledging it in Loudoun County. And what happens? He gets arrested. He gets removed by the police. And of course, in Hong Kong, you could face criminal charges if you decide to gather in Hong Kong and memorialize and remember the Tiananmen Square massacre. Police massed this year outside Victoria Park in Hong Kong, and photos showed that the once crowded expanse standing eerily vacant, because obviously people were terrified. They didn't want to be erased. Authorities have also shut down the Hong Kong Alliance's June 4th museum. Yeah, because you can't have a museum either. The government cited COVID restrictions and a lack of valid licensing, but it's clear the goal is suppression. Kind of like in the United States, right? Churches have to close because of COVID. You can't make your own decision to go inside of a church and to pray and to worship. Oh no, that decision wasn't yours during the pandemic. And in some cases and in some places still isn't. Some of those places, you know, like in California, you're still being restricted. You got to wear a mask. But, you know, just like Hong Kong, the government cited COVID restrictions and improper licensing. So the museum in Hong Kong had to close. But it's clear the goal is suppression in Hong Kong. In September, police raided the museum, seized its assets, and accused the Hong Kong Alliance and 3 of its leaders of incitement to subversion under the national security law. Chairman Lee Chuk-yan and Vice Chairman Albert Ho and Chow Hang-tung now face up to life in prison if convicted. Under duress, the Hong Kong Alliance disbanded last month, so they're facing life in prison because they ran a museum. And part of the museum had what inside of it? Oh, part of the museum had memorabilia and other historical documents about the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Chinese Communist Party's transgressions, as well as historical, ugly periods where tens of millions of people were murdered for the better good of the Chinese Communist Party. Watch next what happens in Hong Kong's classrooms, libraries, and history texts. The South China Morning Post reported this year that some teachers canceled their annual lessons on the Tiananmen Square massacre, fearing they could be targeted under the new national security law. In response to the SMP's inquiries on whether teachers were allowed to give lessons about the crackdown, a spokesman for Hong Kong's Educational Bureau said it was the responsibility of schools to implement national security education under the national security law. The newspaper reported Hong Kong authorities are working to impose a patriotic education curriculum on the city's schools. And it's hard to envision the propagandists allowing a truthful accounting of the Communist Party's slaughter. The Hong Kong Alliance, Mr. Lee told me in May 2020, that if you compare what happened in 1989 and now, it's the same. And that now we are facing this regime just as the people of China faced the regime back in 89. As Hong Kong authorities act to blot out all monuments and memorials, honoring the martyrs of 1989, it's up to the West to remember the Communist Party's victims, past and present. This is in the Wall Street Journal, and this particular opinion piece was written by Gillian K. Melcher, and it's her opinion piece, and I love the ending of it, which is, it's up to the West to remember the Communist Party's victims, past and present, because obviously they will not be remembered in China. And you know who we need to remember here in the United States also? We need to remember the victims in the public school system, the government schools, who aren't being taught but are being indoctrinated. And we, the people, need to take back our public education system and government schools. And the best way to do that is to abandon them. And here's what I mean. I'm not saying that we shouldn't fund them, so don't go after me on that. I'm saying that the money follows the student, and your child takes the money with them to the school that they want to go to, wherever that may be. We've spoken about this before, podcast listeners. If your child is in one public school in one county and you move to a different county, you know what happens? The money from that public school follows your child to the new public school. But that's not the case if your child tries to opt out of the government school system and go to a what? Private school or homeschool or charter school or boarding school, whatever school fits the best needs of your child. Pretty fascinating, huh? And now we have proof that we have a former Maoist in China who's now an American citizen calling this out. And now we see what's happening in Hong Kong. The exact same stuff the left is doing in the United States of America. The exact same stuff. Tearing down statues, rewriting history, implementing CRT so people hate each other. Cracking down on dissent. All the same stuff. The left is the same no matter where they are. They are the most dangerous people. Another opinion piece, the Patriot Act wasn't meant to target parents. Yeah, sure. The Patriot Act wasn't meant to target parents. The Biden administration is abusing federal laws and agencies as instruments of political repression, by James Sensenbrenner. As principal author of the Patriot Act and chairman of the House Judiciary Committee during its consideration, I find it necessary to remind the Biden administration that the Patriot Act doesn't apply to parents' behavior at school board meetings, says James Sensenbrenner. And just to remind you, he's a Republican who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from Wisconsin from 1979 to 2021. And he was the head of and chairman of the House Judiciary Committee from 01 to 07. In other words, during 9/11. In recent months, parents across the country have expressed their views on issues ranging from pronoun selection and critical race theory to the medical basis of certain COVID restrictions and age-appropriate sexually explicit curricular materials. Parents have a right, indeed an obligation, to participate actively at school board meetings to ensure the safety and well-being of their children. In Virginia's Loudoun County and Fairfax counties, moms, dads, and teachers shocked by X-rated reading lists face race-based indoctrination and anti-Christian instruction, and they are beginning to make their voices heard. Rather than embracing a renaissance of spirited and nonviolent civic engagement, Virginia gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe recently said, quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach." Democrats' hostility towards parents seeking a voice in their children's education is not new. Of greater concern is the recent attempt to weaponize our criminal laws to eliminate these voices, like China. When asked this week whether the Patriot Act should be used to monitor parents at school board meetings, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki responded, quote, "The Attorney General has put out a letter. They will take actions they take, and I will point you to them for more information." Ms. Psaki's non-response and Attorney General Merrick Garland's memorandum directing federal counterterrorism agents to monitor parents at local school board meetings is emblematic of the Biden administration's unparalleled effort to transform federal laws and agencies into instruments of domestic political repression. The Patriot Act was enacted into law following the mass terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Its central purpose was to prevent additional foreign terrorist attacks on American soil by enhancing the collection and sharing of foreign intelligence information, restricting terrorist financing, and enhancing border security. The legislation defined terrorism as unlawful acts of violence or acts dangerous to human life intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Some provisions, particularly Section 215 and the issuance of the national security letters, occasioned spirited and necessary debate to ensure against their misuse by federal agencies. So you see, podcast listeners, we have a law that was passed that was right after 9/11, and the purpose of the law was to make us safer, so we thought. And now we have the same law that's being used and abused against American citizens who want to exercise their First Amendment rights. When considering the Patriot Act, I sought a bipartisan consensus that was reflected in its unanimous committee approval. Aware of potential abuse and over the objection of the Bush administration, I ensured the legislation contained sunset provisions and wrote a bill to amend and reauthorize the Patriot Act in 2005. In 2015, I was the author of the USA Freedom Act, which restored the original intent of the Patriot Act by reforming key federal surveillance authorities. So James Sensenbrenner continues to go on and talk about how our very government is using laws that were intended to protect us from terrorism overseas and having those terrorists come into the United States and then commit terrorist acts against all kinds of people, mostly civilians. That same law is being used against everyday Americans because they dare to speak out at school board meetings. Just like in China. You dare to have a memorial to the Tiananmen Square massacre or face life in prison. This is what's happening in this country. The left are the communists. The left are the socialists. The left are the communists. They are the danger to America. They are the intolerant people. And so we have to understand this because we can't get better as a country. We can't heal as a country until we understand that this historically has been what the left does. And if we allow books to be rewritten, history to be rewritten or erased, and this has always been one of my fears, podcast listeners, about history not being taught in schools. Because now, podcast listeners, I know you know this is true. How many times have you wanted to know something and you didn't want to go to the original book that was the book of historical record of that particular issue? And instead you went to Wikipedia, which is like BS. It's not history, Wikipedia. I mean, it's how would you explain it? It's not the true text of things. And the thing is when you start finding things online, you know what can happen? They can be updated. They can be deleted. They can be removed altogether. That's why when you want to learn history, you should get the actual books themselves because they can't be erased. You actually have it in your possession and it can't be removed. And so I'm sure, the baby boomers will be saying, oh, Mark, you're so right. And of course, the millennials are going, oh, you're worried. What are you worried about? There's nothing to worry about. It's just not convenient for me to be able to store all these books. Guess what? It needs to be convenient. You need to find ways to store these books because of the simple fact that so many of them are no longer being taught in the public school system. The average student graduating in America has little or no understanding of America's history, let alone why America was founded. What made America exceptional? They have no idea. They have no clue whatsoever. None. And then if there aren't any references anymore that are accurate online or on Wikipedia, and of course, let's face it, when you type something in, type some query in, Google is going to give you all the leftist crap. That's what they're going to show you. And you have to dig down to 30 pages, 40 pages down to finally get something that may be useful if it hasn't already been eliminated. That's the problem. That's the problem. We have to learn from history. We have to. And we also have to learn that as technology improves, there are enormous dangers that can take away our liberty, and we don't even know what's happening because we aren't paying attention. So get this, podcast listeners. Biden's support is collapsing among Black voters. About a couple of months ago, we were talking about how this was happening. It's interesting, though, of why Black voters are abandoning Joe Biden, and it's not what you might think. So frustration is at an all-time high. Biden's support is collapsing among Black voters. This is in the Daily Wire. It says, according to W. Mondale Robinson, founder of the Black Male Voter Project, frustration is at an all-time high in the Black community regarding Biden's presidency. The Black Male Voter Project claims to have reached more than 1.2 million Black men in Georgia during the 2020 general election and the Georgia runoffs for the United States Senate. Quote, I think the frustration is at an all-time high, and Biden can't go to Georgia or any other Black state in the South and say, this is what we delivered in 2021, said Robinson in an interview with the Washington Post. Black men are pissed off about the nothingness that has happened. Quote, does it make the work harder? It makes the work damn near impossible, he added later. According to the article, there are numerous factors behind this growing frustration, including the willingness of the Democrats in May to significantly weaken a policing reform bill to get Republican support, and Biden's decision not to push for changes to the filibuster to enact a $15 minimum wage or to halt a raft of voting restrictions passed by the Georgia's GOP-led legislature. So in other words, podcast listeners, the article is covering the fact that Black voters are abandoning Biden and don't want to show up in the midterm elections to vote. Of course, that's a solid year away. But they don't want to show up to vote, and they're abandoning Biden, not because they're disaffected with his policies, but because the Democrats haven't delivered on the policies that they promised the Black community. So I have no doubt that many of those promises the Democrats knew they couldn't deliver upon. But there are plenty of others that they wanted to and can't. And the Black community is like, well, wait a minute. Why would we support you if you're not going to at least deliver upon the basic things that you said you would do, which is canceling the police and free, an increase in the minimum wage, irrespective of what the job is and irrespective of what community and state that you live in, whether it relates to the actual cost of living, among many other things. So according to the latest polls, Biden's approval rating has declined to just 44.5%, with 49.2% disapproving of Biden's performance as president, by the way, and that is Black voters. So Biden is upside down with Black voters. Not good if you're a Democrat. And based on Pew Research Center data, Biden's popularity has fallen across all racial groups in just the past few months. For example, Biden's approval rating was 85% among Black voters in July. Conversely, Biden's approval rating has dropped from 45% to 37% for white voters, 72% to 56% for Hispanic voters, and 68% to 54% for Asian voters. During the same time period, 61% of white voters, 40% of Hispanic voters, and 44% of Asian voters disapprove of Biden's performance as president. So this is, of course, interesting because, podcast listeners, it's all about the midterm elections because ultimately that's the only thing that people really care about. And the other thing that's interesting is the press, the mainstream press, podcast listeners, are actually talking about this. Why is MSNBC talking about Biden's collapse in the polls? Why is CNN talking about it? Why is NBC, ABC, CBS talking about Biden's drop in the polls? Because they're worried. Remember, that's their guy. That's the guy they got into office. So Now they're actually worried. They're like, well, maybe we should be abandoning this guy. And then you say to yourself, well, that's kind of funny, because these are the same crooked media folks who got Biden in. And if they abandon him and try to force him out by constantly reporting bad stuff about him, that continues the poll slide. And who would take over anyway? Kamala? Kamala? I mean, give me a break. And so here's another story that hits Biden really hard, hits him right between the eyes, and the Democrats. He's planning to provide aid to the Taliban as the Taliban's economy tanks. Now, remember, our economy, as far as I'm concerned, is tanking. I mean, I believe this for a while. I think the big companies are doing great. I think small businesses, not so much. But Biden's worried about the Taliban. So as the economy tanks, Americans show disapproval with anti-Joe chants. So President Biden and his administration are planning to send American taxpayer money to Afghanistan as the economy continues to tank back home with record inflation, record gas prices, and supply chain chaos. Which, by the way, podcast listeners, the so-called supply chain chaos is nonsense. Because if the goods are there on ships and the ships are right off the shore, it's not that hard to get the cargo off the ships. All right? I mean, there are plenty of solutions to get the cargoes. We've been doing this for a long time. This is not new. So the supply chain stuff is nonsense. It's the management of the economy by the Biden administration that it's causing and wreaking havoc. Sean Hannity said Tuesday during his opening monologue about all of these problems, adding that Americans are beginning to publicly show their frustration with the White House. The U.S. has agreed to provide humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, which is on the brink of an economic disaster, while at the same time refusing to give political recognition to the country's new Taliban government, the Taliban said Sunday. So the U.S. economy is in trouble, and because of government and the way government has managed the economy into the ground, let's face it, we went from a nation that is completely independent, energy independent, to one that is now dependent. So prices for energy are through the roof because of government. And then in Afghanistan, it's a real surprise that when the Taliban took over, that they were going to run the economy into the ground. And we're going to have the Biden administration give them free stuff. I mean, what the heck? State Department spokesman Ned Price called the discussions with the extremist Taliban regime candid and professional. The Biden team stated, however, that the talks in Qatar, or Qatar, however you want to say it, over the weekend should not be seen as a signal of a forthcoming formal recognition of the Taliban government in Kabul. Well, let me see. If you give them money for aid, like food or whatever else they need, wouldn't that by definition be a recognition that they're in charge? Because who do you hand it to? So you put the stuff on a ship or on planes. I guess it would have to be planes because it's Afghanistan. And you send the stuff via plane that you're giving them, food, medicine, what have you, money, to the Taliban. It lands there in the Kabul airport. And who gets it? Well, of course, the Taliban gets it. By definition, you're recognizing them because you're giving them American money. You're transferring wealth from us to them. Unbelievable. So Hannity noted Biden has gone from 40 days without mentioning the American citizens still stranded behind Taliban lines in Afghanistan, despite his planned expenditures of taxpayer funds to the country. The Biden administration is planning to send more money to the Taliban. They're calling it humanitarian aid, but in reality, where I grew up, that looks an awful like a massive ransom payment for terrorism. Well, of course it is. Of course that's what it is. And here at Mark and the Millennials, we have only one thing to say to Joe Biden, and you've heard this clip before. And we call it Let's Go Brandon, but some call it something else. We have that clip, and here it is.
Thank you to all of our partners. Oh my God, it's just such an unbelievable moment.
Brandon, you also told me, as you can hear the chants from the crowd, Let's go, Brandon. Brandon, you told me you were going to kind of hang back those first two stages and just watch and learn. What did you learn that helped you there in those closing laps?
Yes. So let's go, Brandon. Let's go, Brandon. We should just say that from now on. And we plan on doing that pretty much from now until Joe Biden leaves office, which is let's go, Brandon. There's no need to use the expletive because it just kind of says it all right there. A guy who knows how to run the economy into the ground, make a country that is energy independent, energy dependent, a guy that is basically calling Americans who are patriots terrorists and arresting them. I mean, it's just, should we go on? I don't think we need to, other than to segue into China's unstable political economy. This is important. You've probably seen podcast listeners that China is flying all kinds of aircraft very close to Taiwan and clearly challenging Taiwan and clearly challenging the United States and the Biden administration. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of the cheap reasons that communist governments do these things is because their own economy is unstable. Very, very common. The Soviet Union did the exact same thing. Every time the Soviet Union had a very poor harvest, which was pretty much every year, they became very unstable and they became very aggressive internationally with their military and certainly with their words. And naturally, all things were fine later because of the fact that the United States would send them lots of wheat, lots of food. So in the Wall Street Journal, China's unstable political economy, Evergrande's collapse is a sign of deeper weakness, just when President Xi is impatient to challenge the U.S. The world has been watching as the Chinese real estate giant Evergrande fails. So there's this humongous real estate company in China called Evergrande, and it is literally imploding, as many large real estate companies do when they expand too quickly and with cheap money, because obviously as money gets expensive, they get into trouble, or as the economy slows down and they can't fill up their buildings that they built, then they start to fail. That's what's happening in China with this massive real estate company. And some have been asking whether Beijing will soon have a moment akin to the 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers in America. Xi Jinping may manage to prevent the burst of the real estate bubble, but China's economy isn't heading for more sustainable growth. Evergrande's woes, which is the real estate company, are a reminder that China's political economy under Mr. Xi has become even more unstable. Even as Beijing grows more impatient to displace America as the dominant power, time is not on China's side. The global financial crisis that began with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008 in the United States led to a severe liquidity crunch as financial institutions lost faith in the capacity of one another and commercial firms to repay their loans. China's financial system doesn't work this way. Loss of faith in the commercial worthiness of other entities isn't fatal. Instead, banks and other financial institutions unfailingly lend if instructed to do so by their political masters. This happened in 2008 when Chinese state-owned banks injected about $15 trillion of new capital into the economy for fixed investment projects. Sounds like the trillions of dollars of stimulus bills in the U.S. And they did so in China over 6 years as export markets in North America and Europe stagnated. This was about 1.5 times the size of the entire American commercial banking system at the time. Politically driven lending has been a feature of the Chinese political economy ever since. It's not lending based on economics. It's not lending based on the ability to repay. It's lending in China solely based on the fact that you are a Communist Party member and you're gonna engage in graft with Communist Party officials. There are other tools in the Chinese Communist Party kit. Loans and bond payment obligations are forcibly rolled over or deferred to ensure non-performing loans and defaults don't weigh down a lender's books. State-owned and even private firms are compelled to purchase bonds issued by moribund corporate entities. In short, the determinants of liquidity in the Chinese systems are political, not commercial. And the Chinese Communist Party has the tactical wherewithal to avoid a Lehman Brothers moment. But Evergrande's woes are evidence that Beijing is serious, or isn't maybe serious, about getting through this problem. So the article continues, and it's definitely worth reading, podcast listeners, because it talks about the fact that China is engaged right now in a massive default of loans between commercial companies that were building buildings and many other businesses. And those businesses were clearly affected by the shutdown of economies across the globe from the pandemic. They weren't able to ship stuff because people weren't buying stuff because people were, sheltering at home. And in addition to that, people in China, of course, many people I'm sure died during the pandemic. We actually don't know how many. But when you're a country like China that builds stuff for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world just stops buying that stuff because of a pandemic, obviously you're going to be in big trouble, huge trouble. And that's exactly what is happening in China. And I have to say, podcast listeners, it's also Donald Trump, former President Trump, who put the policies in place to make the American people understand that we need to begin to move back manufacturing to the United States, not the least of which is chips, of course. The chips which have, cars have them, everything has them in them now, and we should be making those chips here in the United States. And so many other companies are doing the same thing. Donald Trump also called out Huawei, and Huawei was this massive company in China that was providing telecommunications equipment globally, and now isn't doing so hardly at all, and is also in trouble. That's because of Donald Trump, because Huawei was going to use their telecommunications equipment in the United States to do what? Eavesdrop on Americans. Kind of like what our government's doing now. And also, it was Donald Trump that put into place, which to Joe Biden's administration's credit, continued the idea that Americans would share submarine technology with the Australians and with the English. So with, obviously the UK. That is important. That's really important because that is where we have our huge advantages. And so China is not just showing off its power to Taiwan by sending these planes over the skies, but in addition to that, North Korea is showing off its missiles too. And you ever notice whenever China is unstable and feeling insecure, they have their client state, North Korea, do the same thing. And that's exactly what's happening now, podcast listeners. It's so predictable. The difference is that we have Joe Biden now as president of the United States. And when you have Joe Biden as president of the United States, you don't feel really that good about the possibility that Joe Biden's going to be able to manage through this crisis. Because, podcast listeners, when a Chinese communist government or any communist government is in trouble, they look overseas. They look outside their borders to try to unite their country into some sort of, to get people's minds, I should say, off of the fact that their economy isn't doing very well. Because remember, under President Xi, the Chinese economy has been growing every single year. There really haven't been major crises. And as long as the Chinese everyday citizen figured that their lives were getting better, they weren't going to in any way, shape, or form challenge President Xi or anyone else for that matter, because life was getting better. Quality of life was improving. Not so now. Not so now, because the United States is in the process of transferring lots of this supply chain manufacturing outside of China, and hopefully, at least that's my hope, is back in to the United States. That would be the best of all possible worlds. It would certainly make us a lot safer. And that's China's unstable political economy. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.